And there's his smiling face. Oh man, look how young he looks there. Wow. He's going to talk to us about lettuce. Now, when Randall talked to me and said, we're going to hear about the Lettuce Diaries, I thought, what in the world are the Lettuce Diaries? This is such a weird name. But myself being a member of Toastmasters and a frequent speaker, I know that when I pick a intriguing name, people want to attend and listen more often. So Xavier, I think you did a good job picking a name. I think it's the right way to go. You have to understand this young man, Xavier. Randall wrote down that he is a quadrilingual. Now, I think that means he speaks 4 languages, but I'm not quite sure. But he's an international businessman and innovator, and he focuses primarily on the food and beverage and agricultural industries. This is his expertise. And the expertise is also focused on China. And he has helped companies in China grow from very small to something very large. And they are supplying major brand name companies in China now. He has grown this himself and working with others. And he's going to talk about that a little bit this evening. He wants to enrich people's lives and enrich companies through his vision management. He can foresee things that are going to be coming. I'm not saying he's a psychic or a visionary who can see the future, but he can help people understand what are the possibilities. What could you do if you take certain actions? And he's been able to motivate and help a lot of people around the world be better. So I'm looking forward to his speech tonight. I don't want to steal any more of his thunder before he gets ready to tell us all about it. I would like to turn the screen, virtual screen, over to Xavier, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Michael. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you, Randall, for inviting me. I've known Randall for 20 years when he first invited me to speak at the Rotary in Shanghai when I was operating my business there. Randall, I've talked to you about the structure a bit, so you suggested that maybe I share a few slides with the audience to frame a bit the discussion. But just a quick note on what took me here. So I live in San Francisco today, but I've spent 20 years in China building a business that served fresh foods and salads and lettuce in particular that goes into the burger of KFC and McDonald and all the big fast food chains. So I built a big company that I sold, and since then I've been advising largely multinationals on how to grow their business in China. I moved to San Francisco because I adopted a little girl who was Chinese in 2015, and the US government said that she could not be a citizen if we were not permanent residents here in San Francisco. You can recognize to my accent that I'm French. So forgive me if sometimes my tone or my intonation is not exactly right. Sometimes I stumble a bit. I wrote a book about my experience running a business in China. I guess there's 2 reasons why I wrote that book. One is I wanted to tell a story of entrepreneurship in a country that will change the world. And very often businessmen don't spend the time to reflect on what they've done wrong and what their fears were and the mistakes they've made. And I wanted to write a non-linear story and let the reader learn through me and through my mistakes and experiences. And the second, I wanted to talk about food and China because it's a major country, and because of its own conditions, China will impact the rest of the world. And when we talk about the heated geopolitics between China and the US today, we want to understand China's agriculture and food situation because it drives a lot of their decision. So here is a bit of sharing and framing for the discussion. I've got roughly 28 slides. I'll skip a bit fast on some of the slides and I'll share the document with all of you. I'll send it to Randall later. So you can spend a bit more time on that, but I'll leave enough time for questions and answer because that's probably what you want. But I thought it was important to frame the context of what I'm saying. And then after that, we can have a more free flow discussion. Is that okay?
Sounds good.
Okay. So did you allow me to share? Yeah. Okay. Can you see the screen here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all working fine. So, okay. So first part is the agriculture context in China. When we think of China in agriculture, that's often what we're thinking of. That's a picture of the model farm that Creative Food built. We brought a Californian farmer to teach Chinese how to grow lettuce in a modern way in China. So he took that picture of him on his tractor next to the more classic way of farming in the region. Historically, you've got a big period of hundreds of years before 1949 when the communists take power, where Chinese farmers are essentially working for absentee landlords. They've never owned their land. It's all very fragmented. You've got three phases since the communists take over in 1949. One is a phase of experimentation that I call the lost decades. They've experimented with communes, communal farming, and it yielded no productivity at all. So by 1980, China is in a situation where the agriculture is still medieval. From 1980 to 2008, you've got a period of experimentation. Deng Xiaoping's reform allow farmers to operate their land on a long leasehold of, I think it's 30 years, which incentivized the farmer to do a better job, to improve the quality, and to increase productivity. And you've got a huge rise in productivity at farming level until 2008, combined with huge urbanization. So it's been now 25 years that 30 years that 25 million people are moving in China from the rural area to the cities. And that's affecting a lot the way food is produced in China. And the last part happens post 2008, what I called rapid modernization. And 2008 marked the time, I don't know if you remember in the media, when this infant formula company called Sanlu, that was invested by the largest dairy company in New Zealand, Fonterra, found melamine, which is a carcinogenic melamine, a carcinogenic component in the milk that was going to feed babies. They found that 300,000 babies had kidney problems because of that. It caused a scandal in the world and in China in particular, where parents said our babies are dying because they're eating an infant formula that was supposed to be the safest infant formula in China. And that caused a shift in the mindset of the leadership in China, from a mindset that was all about protecting the peasant farmers at the cost sometime of food safety or productivity. Chinese leader decided that it was time to create some scale in the countryside. The main reason why we had this issue of infant formula in China is that the supply chain for dairy was plagued with multiple intermediaries who added up this carcinogenic component because it tested as protein when it got delivered to the big dairy processors. So these intermediaries caused the problem, not the farmers, but the supply chains were so fragmented and so long that it gave too many opportunities for evil people to do bad things. So the government, after that, shut down thousands of small dairy processors and then said, if you want to do dairy farming or dairy processing and you're not putting $200 million on the table, you don't get a license. You got to operate at scale, because if you've got bigger business, it's easier to control and to make sure you're doing the right things. So since 2008, there's been a very rapid modernization. So that's a bit of a framework here. So today, agriculture in China increasingly looks like this. It's increasingly mechanized. You've got a lot of experimentation with greenhouse farming. This is a modern dairy farm. From nearly zero in 2008, today, 70% of the milk produced in China is produced in dairy farms that make up 1,000, that have 1,000 animals and plus. So that's probably the fastest modernization that you've ever seen in the world. It took us 100 years in Europe to go from peasant farming to reasonably sized family farms. China did that in the space of 10 years. And of course, with very strong government will. And that's been driven also by a consumer that is increasingly sophisticated, that wants safe food, that wants clean food, They also want clean air, by the way, and they don't want pollution. And there's always a bit of a tendency on our part, we foreigners and Western people, to look at China and say, oh, poor Chinese, they don't get it. And they've got such a horrible government and such a horrible leadership, and they're so unhappy, and we're going to help them. But the reality is that they are driving the change. They're telling their government today in online chat rooms, we're pissed. We want clean air, we want safe food, and we have to adjust. And the government does adjust. And there is a social contract. It's not written, it's not democratic, but they're adjusting according to the will of their people. So this is a small extract. I'm not going to read it with my bad French accent for you, but you can read a few words. I think what I was trying to say here is that these consumers who are driving the change, they follow the same trend as what we know in the West. They want healthier food, they want safe food, they want to eat differently, but they're doing it in a different way. So I meet businessmen here in the US who tell me, oh, China, I've got this amazing cereal bar, and you think we've got some chance to market it and export it to China? And I say, yeah, well, cereal bars are healthy, but Chinese have their own way of looking at health product. And one of the ways they look at it is by reconciling the principles of Chinese medicine with their idea of what health means. And that's very interesting because I thought Chinese medicine would disappear with the older generation. And what I find in my interviews of consumers in China is that even young generations, they all go back to the principles of balance between heat and cold in the food that they eat. So when they see a cereal bar, they see heat, and they don't see something that they can balance in a healthy way. So that's something that one wants to understand when you look at China. So this change in consumption patterns is going to create tremendous stress on the supply chains and on the way. So one figure to remember, China is feeding 25% of the world population with 9% of the world arable land. That's a big country, but it's nothing like the US. It's got mostly deserts and mountains. So this is a country that is constantly under threat of having a lack of food for their people. And the stress of the second period of modernization from the 80s to 2008 has really caused tensions in the way food is produced. Farmers have been using huge amount of chemicals and fertilizer to increase productivity. The soils are exhausted. Because of urbanization, you've got less and less farmers, you've got less and less water, and you've got all this combined to create climate change effect. There's a plan by the Chinese government to address that, but there's also a lot of fear, and it's represented in the latest initiatives that the Chinese government has taken. So the implication of that context that I just presented to you here is one, China is never going to be an exporter of food. China is always going to be a net importer of food. And I was interviewed by a podcaster last week who was saying, what are the opportunities for American food manufacturers to source from China? And my answer is probably zero, because China was exporting some food, largely fish or dried vegetable or frozen vegetable, that were labor intensive when labor in China was cheap. But labor in China is not cheap anymore. It's been increasing at a rate of 8 to 10% per year for the past 20 years. And it's not anymore a low-cost production area. And because of the context I just described, they have no particular geographical advantage in producing food for the rest of the world. So it's reflected in the statistics. China's food export have been flat at $70 billion annually for the past 5 years. On the other hand, China's import of food have increased at double digit for the past 15 years since the scandal of 2008. Chinese themselves have said, we can't trust our own food anymore. Got to buy it from somewhere else. And they've been driving imports from regions of the world that are perceived as clean and safe and pure. So you're thinking Australia, New Zealand, Canada, I was talking to a Canadian seafood company listed in Toronto. They said they've got half of their sales, a third of their sales in China already, and it's nearly half of their profit. So not only Chinese are importing food, but they're paying a premium for that. And the second challenge is that food security challenges is going to drive the structure of that export. So what the Chinese government has done in the recent months is to say that they want to be independent and they want to have food security. And you're going to tell me, well, if they're feeding 25% of the world with 9% of the arable land, they will never have food security. So they're making choices. They're saying any type of grain like rice or wheat that feeds our people, we want to keep it inside China. We don't want to import it. But the grain like soy that goes into animal feed, then we don't mind importing it. So imports, even under the current geopolitical tension, the imports of soybean from the US have exploded in 2021 from China. And they're making a trade-off. They're saying, okay, so we're not going to be independent when it comes to animal food, but we're going to reserve a part of the land in China for grain production, for human consumption, to avoid these famines that we've experienced in the 50s and 60s, because it's still in the collective psyche that there is this fear of lacking at some point. It is also my deep belief that this type of context is impacting the geopolitical choices that China is making. When you have a lot of your food coming through the Taiwan Strait, you don't want to be subject to a blocus or blockade by foreign nations that would cut you off from your food supply. And that explains also a lot of the initiatives on that. So without getting into politics, that's important to understand the food situation and the food production situation of China to understand what drive some of the surprising and aggressive moves by the Chinese government. The third point I would make is that China has a vested interest in tackling climate change in the current global negotiations because they are experiencing it firsthand in their own country, because their own people are fed up with air pollution and lack of food safety, and it's already changing dramatically. I'm seeing it myself in my trips in the countryside in China. So now back to the book that I wrote. I built a company that is now a $150 million company that started trying to sell salads to the Chinese, failed at it, and pivoted to largely answer the need of the big fast food chains like Starbucks and KFC and McDonald in China, and help them find a solution to their perishable food supply. To say, every time you enter a new city, you have a headache because you have to find a supplier, retrain that supplier with all the risks associated to that. So I'm going to be that supplier. So I built 9 factories across China, and I did if you eat a sandwich or a wrap in a Starbucks in China, it's probably coming from one of my factories. Just an idea of magnitude, KFC in China has close to 10,000 restaurants. McDonald has close to 6,000 restaurants. Starbucks is opening 1,500 restaurants a year. I think they're probably at 7,000 stores already. So this is massive, and this is growing very, very big, and soon going to be much bigger than their US market. I tell the story in the book of, I always think that you don't want to talk about your successes, you want to talk about your failures. It makes it for a much more interesting read. So it was not easy. We had factories in flame, we had floods, we were on the verge of bankruptcy many times. But one of the things I say in the title is that how a Frenchman found gold in China. Let's be frank, I didn't find gold in a monetary term in China. Some literary critic said in a review of the book that I probably would have made more money investing in Hong Kong real estate than selling my shares in my company. But the gold I found in China, in my experience, is this knowledge and understanding of the Chinese farmers who are at the origin of this food production that I talked about. These people that I thought were cheating me had to deal with a historical context that was so much more complex than I ever anticipated. And it made them look much more human to me. And it helped me gain a major respect for who they were. And I learned to understand how they thought and to create an alignment between their interest and my interest in order to build a successful supply chain to serve my multinational clients. So these are small pictures here. We did not replicate California in China. China is modernizing, but it's in its own way. These are small equipment. The operation of Creative Food are now very, very modern. That's the farm near Shanghai. Now, Randall was telling me that he thought it would be interesting to say a word about how the food supply chain are changing in China. And so back to the historical context. Today, at a level of urbanization that is around 70%, you still have 500 million farmers in China. And they're all farming, in average, less than 1 acre of land. So when you're buying massive volume of lettuce, in my case, or food in general from these people, you're at the mercy of one of them doing the wrong thing or adding a toxic element to his lot in order to cut a corner. And suddenly you've got a food safety incident in the market. And, my clients, they were always very, very, very scared because nobody will say that I failed or I failed the consumer. Everybody's going to say that McDonald or KFC failed the consumer. So I find it very interesting to see how China is taking that particular context, this very fragmented food supply chain, and leveraging it to do something entirely new. So my idea was that China would follow the model of the Western nations, where we slowly, over the course of a century, consolidated the supply, consolidated the demand, and created these giant retail stores in the US or these giant farms in the Salinas Valley in California. China is not doing it this way. What's happening in China is that you've heard about the big digital ecosystems like Alibaba and JD.com, who have been creating a route to market for hundreds of millions of people living in the cities. They've started by building the platform that delivers the electronic gadgets and the household product that they need. What's happened since 2015 is that these massive companies have said, okay, so we've got these hundreds of millions of consumers, we've got an infrastructure to deliver goods to them. We also understand through the data what they buy, how they think, and why they buy things. Now we're going to pivot and connect the 500 million farmers with these 900 million consumers in the market. And that's very interesting because for the first time, the farmer gets to sell directly to the consumer through these digital platforms. And in the past, he was selling to a middleman and he had no idea. And you can imagine that if you have a connection with your buyer, you're much more careful about what you're selling to that buyer because you know him and you respect him. If you're selling to a wholesaler or random trader, you can be tempted to cut some corners. So that's happening on a massive scale. There's billions of dollars investing in supply chain. And here's a quick example of what Alibaba, for example, is trying to do. On the left side, this is the traditional supply chain. The grower of oranges in that region is selling to a small village-based buyer. It crosses the province. It changes hands 2 or 3 times before it gets to the big cities of Beijing or Shanghai. And by that time, the price has been multiplied by 9. What Alibaba is doing now is saying, I know what consumers buy and what type of oranges they buy and what price they're willing to pay for that. And I'm going to go to that farmer and organize the planting for them. And I'm going to leverage my digital platform to offer them financing. You know that Alibaba also owns Alipay and that Chinese use digital payments at a rate that is 60 times higher than the Americans. So I'm going to leverage that. I'm going to provide financing and I'm going to reverse completely that supply chain and do that. So that's an example. That's not happening on a huge scale, but this is the type of initiatives that are happening. Another type of initiative that is happening is that the digital platforms are allowing consumers in the same compound in a city, living in the same compound, to group purchase together a lot of vegetables or meat or fruits from one particular farmer. So before that, alone, you can't do that. You can't arrange a truck from the other side of the country to come to the city. But think Groupon on steroids, allowing hundreds of millions of city-based consumers to group purchase the food that they deem safe for them and their family. And it's happening on a massive scale. Think Meituan, the large meal delivery company, was losing $2 billion in the Q1 of 2021. And a large part of that loss was created by the building of the infrastructure to connect the farmers with the consumers. So they're recreating in a way a giant digital village. And in the book I talk about the I chased back a small farmer in Sichuan who had studied at university, who had left the village and studied at university, and he could have made his life as an agronomist for a big company in Beijing, but he decided to come back to the village and teach the local villagers how to grow their blood orange in the right way. And he was talking in a very moving way about how he's created a WeChat account and he's video streaming his product to his consumers, and he feels completely accountable to the consumers because he gets direct feedback about the quality that what he does, and he makes triple the average income in the region because of that. So everybody seems to benefit in that what I call hidden revolution. So the lessons learned here, I'm gonna go fast on that, but we can come back on it in the question and answers if it's something that you find interesting. Is a couple of things we did wrong at the beginning that, 18 months into the start of my company, I was nearly bust. One of the things I tried to do is bring what had been done in California to build the salad market in the US in the 90s to China, and it was way too costly. I tried to sign contracts with Chinese peasant farmers the same way you sign contract in the Salinas Valley with massive industrial farming corporations. I tried to set Californian standards in China that were not understood and were not practical for the Chinese environment. They were impossible to enforce. And at the end, after all this mistake, I usually found myself isolated and blamed China and the Chinese people for my failures. So I repeat that a bit here with a mindset that consists in saying, I know better, and what worked elsewhere will work in China. I started with a very rigid way of doing things, and I slowly lost the credibility with my leadership team, lost talents, lost people. That increased my loss. I found myself increasingly isolated, and in leadership courses, you find yourself below the line. You act as a victim and you blame everybody, and everybody is against you. And I hear that a lot among foreign businessmen these days, and we can talk about that a bit more in detail. When that was happening, I made a choice in the book to be very personal and to be very candid about my emotion, my feeling, my mistakes. And in a way, I thought I was writing a book about food in China. And what seems to resonate the most with people who wrote this book is this journey of an entrepreneur who is learning to become a leader. And I chose to expose myself a bit more, and it seems to resonate with people who are reading the book. So we pivoted, and what did we do right is I found myself very quickly with a group of Chinese people. After I let go of all the expatriates, I found myself with a group of Chinese people who didn't speak a word of English, but who knew the operating environment. And I started to listen to them. And we changed the way we did things. We changed the way we did contract. I talk about a lunch with one of my executive, where for the first time I realized that he knew so much more than I did. The problem is that I was never asking before. I was telling. So I started to listen, and we changed things, and things went better. And 6 years later, we sold the business for $20 million to one of the leading European players in the fresh food business, and they still own that business. And the people who were there, that's probably my biggest pride. This morning, the entire management team sent me a picture of them holding the book. They finally got the book through an agent who helped them buy it offshore. And they're still there. So 15 years into it, this management team in an operating environment where most companies lose their talent every day because there's a scarcity of this talent, they're still there. So what did we do right? We started with a humble mindset. We said, we're going to accept that what worked elsewhere is not going to work in China. We've got to do things differently. And for Randall, it's going to resonate really well because you've been very successful doing that. And then we adapted, and we were very flexible in the way we did things. We had a very clear vision. And that's one thing that characterized Chinese companies, the Alibabas and JD.com. They're led by entrepreneurs who have very strong visions, but they're very flexible in the way they adapt to their environment. That generated confidence among our employees. They helped recruit new talents, and we entered that virtuous circle that created profit and allowed us to invest and accelerate. So I'll skip this because this is the mistake that most multinationals do in China. They have legitimate fears about entering China because what they read in the newspaper, because what they hear from business colleagues, but this fear creates a vision that is weak and that undermines the commitment. And that means that all their stakeholders in China sense that and feel that. And from there, you get back to that circle here that I described, this one here. So what Chinese companies do really well is create a clear vision and be very, very attached to that vision. So often people ask me, what are the lessons that you would share for people who want to do business in China? So here are 5 points. Get a very strong vision, something that guides you even when things turn south or don't go as you want, because that's something that will provide a rallying cry for your employees and your talents. Second, make sure you've got a moat, because China has this swarm effect. If you do something right, you're going to have hundreds of competitors trying to duplicate what you do, and they're going to do it for half the price because they cut corners or because they're just more efficient in that operating environment. So make sure that you've got either the IP is offshore, cannot be copied, or you can protect that IP in China, or in the case of many food producers, they have the supply, have access to the supply that doesn't exist in China. So the New Zealand meat processors of grass-fed beef, there's no way you can do grass-fed beef on an industrial or at scale in China because of the context I described to you. So they have a protection, and they're all very successful doing this. Build a safe space. Many of the employees in China will see the company as much more than a place to work. They come from, because of the urbanization, they come from rural regions. They usually don't have connections of network in the city, and the company is their place if where they spend most of their social interaction. It's really important to create that concept. Starbucks did it really well by, for example, allowing their employees to endorse their parents on their health insurance. So providing parents a level of security that made them worship what Starbucks was doing. So suddenly you're trying to pull your employees forward, and you've got the parents in the back who are pushing their children, saying, don't mess it up because you've got a great employer. Number 4, accept that China has its own rules. I've seen people building factories at EU standards and then complaining that their factory was not deemed compliant in China, and having to rebuild the factory completely to meet Chinese standards. And my answer is always, you're operating in China, why don't you respect Chinese regulations? We used to engage the local officials and on the blueprints and ask them, we want to do it to EU standard. What do you think? And he would say, oh, no, you got to change this, that. And what happens is that he's got ownership on the project, and he's going to look good because you're going to be compliant. So he tends to be much more supportive of you. So it's about aligning your interests rather than being antagonistic. And number 5 is, I always say, try to be more like a Chinese company. Have a very strong vision, but be very agile in your execution. Spend less time planning and adjust, throw paint against the wall. You're bound to fail a number of times before you succeed in the end. And that's a bit what I retell in the book. I tell about all my mistakes until I finally succeeded in a humble way. And I wish that it will inspire more entrepreneurs to come to China and do the same. So that's a bit my thing. If you want to know a bit more, I've put some links here. As Michael said, I've got an activity as a strategic consultant. My clients are usually $500 million plus in revenue. I work with McDonald, I work with Ted and Lyle, I work with Colgate. And I've got, because multinationals are sometimes more like Spanish galleons, they're slow and hard and bureaucratic. I've built a coaching activity where I work with small size businesses that are $15, $20 million and plus, and helping them scale up here in the US, but also in China. So that's a bit what I do. Now I'm going to stop talking, and I'm happy to answer any question you may have.
Hey, Xavier, will you close your screen share, please?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. First of all, Xavier, thank you very, very much for a very understandable presentation. It's not about Russia and America, it's about China. And this is a pleasant change for us. We've been focusing for the last almost 2 years, almost strictly on Russia and the United States. We have heard a little bit from a few other people, but not much from China. So this is very, very interesting. And I'm sure it's eye-opening for some of the people who have not done that, who have not dealt with China before. So thank you very, very much for your comments. I'm going to put mine on gallery view so I can see everybody's face on the screen. And if anybody has a question, please raise a hand. I'll see that. And then, oh, okay, Robert, you're right there first. Jump right in, Robert. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. Really enjoyed it. I just want a simple clarification on page 12 in your presentation. You were talking about imports and exports under the first, well, we don't call them bullets anymore. That's too aggressive. We call them love dots. But the second one about about wine and oils and fruit, was that imports or exports?
Imports. Chinese
Okay.
are buying, think anything that is expensive and valuable, they're buying it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Randall, you had your hand up second. Randall, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Michael. And thank you very much, Xavier. It's nice to have you back again after 2 decades. I just want to ask a couple of questions and make a couple of statements. So one thing I remember stepping into Shanghai more than 20 years ago is how there was nobody ate salad, and I couldn't buy lettuce.
Yeah.
And I remember very clearly, it was the Holiday Inn, which had a little buffet, which Frank and I would go to, my Rotarian friend would go for lunch. And the most exhilarating thing was I could get a salad with lettuce. I could make a salad. And I guess the Chinese people in general still do not like cold salads. They don't eat them the way people do in the West.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the first point. Second thing, I just want to ask you a question. Why do Chinese not like dill pickles? They have garlic, they like salty food, but nowhere in the country could I ever get decent dill pickles. And the ones that came occasionally from a carbin, they were in a can, they were nasty. What is it? I mean, the Chinese have cucumbers, they've got all the ingredients, but it's a completely different taste for them, is it? Is it cultural? Is it taste?
I don't know if it's a different taste, because you've got tons and tons of pickled vegetables in China. I just think that they see it as one type of pickles. For us, we don't have many pickled vegetables that we eat. The Chinese have, and Koreans too, have a wide range of choices. So they just look at it as one of them. It's not the only one.
We have a lot here in Russia, and I wonder if you know anything about the perception. You mentioned Canada, US, UK, other countries, the Chinese perception of the food quality in other countries. Do you know anything about their perception of food quality in Russia?
No, I remember that I did a borscht soup for Pizza Hut at one point, and and that they all loved it. They all thought it was I think they associate Russia and Eastern Europe with this tomato meaty stew that they call lo song tang in Chinese.
Okay, and one more little thing,
Second.
which is really a big thing. Why? What took you to China, and why did you want to sell them something from the ground?
Yeah, that's a great question. I came to China as an expat, and I had no intention of starting a business. I said it's going to be a 2-year career boosting assignment, and then I'm going to sign I'm going to sign the place where I want to go to run a country. I was working for a multinational called Compass Catering, that you may know, Sodexo, Aramark, Compass. So they do they manage staff restaurants, schools restaurants, factory restaurants. And I was the CFO for China. So that's the way it happened. And the company had this tiny little business supplying lettuce for KFC. And it was one room with 10 ladies on a stainless steel table cutting vegetables manually. And KFC at the time had 300 restaurants in China. And today they have close to 10,000. And they knew they would ramp up really fast and said, you guys have to get your acts together. And I put a business plan together for the business to invest more in processing line and growing vegetables in an integrated way. And I remember the board in London of this London listed company said to me, we're not going to say to the stock exchange that we're the kings of vegetables in China. We're a restaurant company. We don't do that. We're not going to invest in factories. But if you want to do something with it, we'll help you. So I spun off the business in a separate entity. And it was 2000. We were in the middle of the internet, the first internet bubble. And I said, I'm going to do a B2B internet platform selling vegetables to China and leverage that existing business to make some cash flow. And I raised money just on that idea from private equity investors. And I saw myself listed on the stock exchange 2 years later and multimillionaire. And guess what? It was a bit harder than that.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate it. Antonina, you had a question?
Yes, my question was sometimes in 90s when I was in a mushroom business, producing business, we were kind of contacting with our Chinese colleagues. And what amazed me at that time, that quality control of chemicals used in production was almost none in China. And for example, they were using DDT just against many illnesses, okay, during production of mushrooms. From your point, what is quality of Chinese, like a Shanghai or Chinese products at the moment? Are they improving in terms of value? I mean, clean value, with missing these pollutants, basically.
So I hear what you're saying, and you're completely right. Back 20 years ago, there were very strict regulations about not using things like DDT. It was just not enforced. And the reason it's not enforced is not because the people are evil or they don't want to enforce it. It's just because of this massive amount of people. Your mushroom suppliers, they were probably buying from hundreds of thousands of different small farmers. So if one of them did not do the right thing, then you were in trouble. So the regulations were there, it was just not enforced. The second issue that you had at the time is that the awareness, people did not know. The farmers did not know. I remember talking to a cabbage supplier in Shandong who was using formaldehyde. I mean, this is what you put in your car to wash your glasses. Formaldehyde on the cabbage. They were dipping it in formaldehyde because I think it was helping the cabbage to last longer during transportation. And I said to him, do you realize how bad it is? And his answer was, it's okay, you just peel out the outer leaf before you eat it. So there was a level of awareness around food safety issue that was not there. Now, Fast forward 25 years later, it's changed dramatically. And why is it changed dramatically? Because consumers are in charge. Because consumers, you've got today in China, you've got nearly 35% of groceries that are bought online. And in the US, as a comparison, it's less than 5%. It's not there yet. So when hundreds of millions of people buy product online, they leave feedback on the supplier. If something happens, if there's a food poisoning, if there's a problem, they leave feedback. So there's a much higher level of accountability. And of course, in the countryside, people have improved a lot too, because everybody has a mobile phone in China, and people are exchanging best practice and ideas with each other through small videos. I found myself, for example, traveling to Sichuan in the western part of the country one day, meeting a group of farmers, and then taking the plane, crossing the country. I probably flew 2,000 miles to another region. I went to mountainous region, very remote village. When I arrived at the village, people all pulled their phone and they had videos of me in the previous village talking about my stuff with the other villagers. So people were part of some group where they were exchanging best practice within the same industry, and they were already aware. So today, you've got one, higher awareness by consumers who are able with digital tools to hold farmers accountable. Second, you've got a government that is a bit more sophisticated. The local government officials know their job better. They understand what pathogens are and how dangerous they are. And it was not the case 25 years ago. And third, you've got farmers who, there's less farmers in the countryside than 25 years ago. And as a result, the one who stayed back, who did not move to get a job in the cities, they're also the best farmers. So they're a bit better. So they lease their neighbors' land, they've got a bit bigger farms, and they've got more to lose because they've invested in their farms. So they look more like a European family farms and less like a peasant farming entity. So the combination of these three factors means that you've got dramatic improvements. And there's a bit of difference between produce, where it's still family farming, and animal husbandry, where it's highly industrialized and easier to control after the scandals of 2008, as I explained before. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you, Xavier. Appreciate it. Natalia Lachat, you got the next question.
Presentation, Xavier. Thank you very much. I have a question. You mentioned that even young generation follows traditional Chinese diet practices, which are, as I can understand, healthy. So how does this reconcile with the growth and popularity of such companies as KFC? The reason I'm asking is I talk very often about China with a person who has been visiting the country for the past 10 years, at least once a year, and stays there for 6-5 months. And he told me that the number of obese people that he sees every year is growing.
Yeah, you're completely right. I think there's the statistics that the Chinese government itself released that says that 13% of Chinese have diabetes, which is huge. 13% of 1.4 billion people. It means you've got 150 million people with diabetes. So we're all consumers and we all talk about health. And I remember being in a KFC in Hong Kong and being in front of the counter and saying to the general manager of KFC Hong Kong, you should have a salad here, on these pictures, because people want healthy product. And his answer was, yeah, everybody talks about being healthy and all the consumers says they'd like to have a salad in KFC, but where they're in front of this counter, what they want is fried chicken, and they're not going to buy a salad. And so the first fundamental undercurrent, I would say, is that people like to buy what they what tastes good, even if they talk about being healthy. Now, the KFC is not anymore a thing that is new in China. Same for McDonald. So it's lost a bit of prestige. And what happens is people who go to KFC, they're not the trendsetters. So when I talk about people refocusing on Chinese medicine, this is the middle class and upper middle class. This is a 200 million people group in a 1.4 billion population. And because it's China and because it's a small fraction of the population, so everything you say is right, the others are still eating nonsense, but there's a growing portion of that population that is increasingly focused on healthy solution. And these people don't eat at KFC, but they do things a bit differently. I described, for example, how Miss Lee, one of my daughter's friend's mom at school, she was saying, you know, Chinese eat pork at a rate that is 5 times higher than any other country in the world, but their consumption of beef is much lower. So she was saying that when her husband found out that his uncle died of cancer, he quickly connected the disease with his lifestyle. The uncle was drinking a lot, he was eating a lot of seafood and a lot of pork. And he made the decision to cut out completely his pork consumption and replace it with beef. So his idea of health was not, I'm going to eat plant-based protein. His idea of health was, I'm going to change the type of meat I'm consuming, and I'm going to eat a leaner meat. And that's a bit the way it translates. So it's a bit slower. It's not as dramatic as in the US, but it's changing very fast.
Okay.
Does this
Thank
make
you.
sense?
Right, very good. Very good. Thank you. Tom, you had a question, Tom Ross?
Yes, Xavier, wonderful presentation, learned a lot. In Singapore, they started vertical farming in the downtown area. How is that expanding in China? And what is your opinion of that?
Oh yeah, I gotta be careful about what I say here. So that's one of the things McDonald asked me. They said, "Oh, we gotta go into this vertical farming. How do we do that?" Because, you know, a company like McDonald in Japan air freights iceberg lettuce from California to Japan in the peak of the winter because Japan doesn't have the climate to grow iceberg lettuce. So you can imagine how costly it is and how unsustainable it is from an environment point of view. And it just looks bad. So they're saying, oh, is the vertical farm the solution? So we looked into that. At this stage, vertical farm works in places where there's high urban concentration. So in theory, it would work in China. The problem with vertical farms is that it's very high capital investment, and you're very limited in the type of vegetable that you can grow. So the vertical farms that you see in the US today or in Singapore, they're producing cherry tomatoes, baby leaves for salad consumption. As Randall said, Chinese don't eat salads. And McDonald's, what they need is these icebergs that wrap around, the leaves wrap around, and it takes enormous amount of energy. And only the sun today is able to provide enough energy for the iceberg to form that ball that we know. And vertical farms have not been able to do that. So vertical farms are changing very fast. The cost of energy and this, how do you call that? The lights that they use to grow the vegetables is decreasing by nearly 30% every year. So what I see today is that you have in the industry the opposite of the first mover advantage. The people who invested $200 million in a vertical farm 3 years ago, they find themselves with these legacy assets that are very expensive. And the people who are starting to make money with these vertical farms, they have bought the technology very recently. So my view on that is sit back, watch a bit how it plays out. It's going to keep going down and somebody's going to come up with the right technology. But to serve the fast food chains, most of these vertical farms are making product today that cater to an aspirational elite of consumers who want baby leaf that tastes better. They're not solving the world hunger problems.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Randall, I see you have your hand up. Hold on 1 second. I have a comment for both Tom and Xavier. Tom, the reason why the vertical farming won't work over there is because the Chinese knows that the water buffaloes won't walk up the side of a wall. They only walk horizontally. They could get them to walk vertically, then maybe they would work. But right now, they haven't figured out how to get the water buffalo to walk vertically. So that's the reason. Randall, go ahead. You had a question, and then Walter, you'll be next. Randall, go ahead.
Going back to your slides, Xavier, I'm curious, you mentioned one of the recommendations you had was to build a moat. And I'm curious, what was the moat that you built? Because you were I don't know if there's IP associated with growing lettuce.
Yeah, well, I guess I had two modes. One was a very technical one. In China, when we started manufacturing salads that we cut and clean and put in a bag for KFC, the local authority had no idea how to set the bacteria standards or the food safety standards for that product because they'd never seen that. So they choose the ice cream standard, a cooked product for my salads. So we had a very low threshold of bacteria, which meant that any mistake in the production process would cause a surge in bacteria standard and would deem your product unconsumable according to Chinese authority. And at the time, and that means that you needed to do 1,000 little things right to avoid that from surging. Because if a government inspector went to a McDonald restaurant in the back of the kitchen and inspected one of the bags of salad in the fridge, if they found that the bacteria standard was above the threshold, they would say, you're off, you've got to throw it away and you pay a penalty. And we would get a customer complaint. And at that time, there were not many people in China who could do that. We were the only one who could manage and to do that. And I remember KFC pushing me to lobby the government to change the standard. And I always acted passive resistant because I knew it was my moat. Because otherwise I would have a swarm of competitors who would come in and do it for cheaper than I did. And because I had a bit this moat, I was able to very quickly, I was also very aggressive, saying to KFC, wherever you are, I'll build a plant. And I built 9 plants very quickly and operated at scale very quickly. So by the time Chinese competitors caught up and were able, and many of them were my own growers who ended up building a plant, they found themselves operating below scale because they only had a fraction of my market share. And I was able to continue to operate effectively despite my heavier overhead structure.
How much market share did you have?
I had 70% market share.
That's pretty good. That's healthy.
Very good. Thank you. Walter, your question, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. I have 2 questions. The first, please, first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and your insights. What's your name?
My name is Xavier.
Xavier or Javier?
Xavier. No, Xavier.
Xavier. Oh, okay. Xavier. Bon.
You pronounce it perfectly.
Yeah, just wondered. And the second one is throughout your presentation, you mentioned that when you talk to other either experts or foreign businessmen, I guess it was, and they had a difficult attitude towards when you shared failure or something. I'm not sure what the real context was. Maybe you can help me there. And I was wondering what it was, but you didn't go into very detail. So I was wondering what it was about the failure attitude when you share your lessons learned with other foreign businessmen.
Okay. So on the concept of failure is that, so I said, I compared it to the local Chinese businesses, the local entrepreneurs, the Jack Ma and all these people. What they do is that they have a very strong vision. They have an idea of where they want their company to be 10 years from now. And they communicate that vision very aggressively to all their teams, that they're very attached to their vision. They're constantly talking about it. And think Jeff Bezos when he talked about the everything store. You know, when he was talking about the everything store in the mid-2000s, I had no idea what he meant. I thought he wanted to do Walmart, and I just did not understand. So he had that vision. And but then they don't plan a lot. So they take a lot of initiatives. They start businesses, they start initiatives, they lose money for a few months. But if it doesn't work, they shut it down. And there's no qualms, there's no blaming. There's no saying, there's no firing of the guy who was in charge of that project. That guy just moves to another project. And that's something that multinationals really struggle with because they spend an enormous amount of time planning for their next 5 years in China. They have to convince the executive committee in the US. They have to convince the stock market in the US. And then suddenly it doesn't work like they want, and it's perceived as a failure. And that's what I call the stop and go. And then suddenly they have to stop. And what happens is that they hire all this talent in China to build their business. And then suddenly they stop and say, oh, we got to shrink the business, or we're going to do it differently. And people sense that hesitation. They sense that lack of commitment to the ambitious vision. And when they get a phone call from a headhunter, guess what? They're just picking the phone and they're going away. They're saying it's easier to work in a Chinese company because we don't have to educate all the time our bosses about the Chinese operating environment.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting indeed.
Yes, Eugene, you had a question.
Before I have the question, Javier, I have only one word for you, and that is WOW. Wow.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a nice adventure.
Javier, I need your education on this. Did I grasp that via technology that the peasant farmer could stay as a peasant farmer and he would be guided by technology from the marketing entity? Am I way out? In other words, can I stay on my little plot of ground and still exist?
Yes and no. So the classic peasant farmer on his little plot of ground is probably too unsophisticated to take advantage of that. But what will happen to that guy is that he's not going to make enough money and he's going to take a job in the city. The people who stay back in the village, who increasingly, the people who return after leaving the village, they go to university, they have an experience elsewhere, and they come back to the village because they want a different lifestyle. These people, yes, they become this modern farmer who can take advantage of selling their product online through these platforms. And they make much more money. I'll tell you an anecdote. There's this, are you familiar with kiwi fruits? The New Zealand famous fruit, this one of superfruit. So China is the origin of kiwi fruits in the world. So the kiwi fruits come from China. They were brought to New Zealand 100 years ago. And I met with kiwi fruit growers in Sichuan province, and these guys were so successful that they wanted to buy themselves an Audi A8, these beautiful Audi German cars. They went to the Chengdu Audi concession and they said, we want, and the Chengdu guy just looked down on the farmers and he said, well, you're farmers, you can't afford an Audi. And they got so angry that they went back to the village, they teamed up together and they bought the entire concession in Chengdu for Audi. These guys were making in excess of $300,000 per household, growing and selling kiwi fruits, in a region where the average rural income is $1,500 per year. So
my final question.
Yeah.
Javier. Darn it. But my final question is, I did not have this idea that China was looking forward to or quite active towards the environment. Like the last time I was in Beijing, I never saw the blue sky. And I'm delighted to hear, or am I right in understanding that they are concerned now with the environment?
Yeah, so I mean, we're in a small committee here, so I'll speak completely frankly. I believe deeply that there's a social contract in China, and that social contract gets amended regularly. It's an autocratic government, it's not a democratic government, but there's a social contract. The social contract from the 90s to the early 2000s was, we're going to bring you wealth and you let us keep the power. That social contract got amended in the early 2010 because people got so upset about the lack of blue sky, the food safety. And one of the advantage of monitoring entirely the internet in your country is that you also know what people are talking about on the chat rooms. And people were all talking about this issue of climate. And from 2013 to now, I've seen dramatic changes in the countryside and in the cities. And the government has really added to that social contract. It's not enough anymore to bring you wealth. We need to bring you also blue sky and safe foods. And it's changed a lot everywhere. As an example, when I was running my business, if I had to invest $1 million in a new sewage system to meet the EPA regulations, I could sit down with the local government and say, this is an expensive thing. I'm a big employer in the city, I'm a big taxpayer in the city. Can you cut me some slack and break it down over 3 years so that I comply every year a bit more, but you give me some time? Today, it's impossible. All the entrepreneurs are telling me, local officials tell them, I have no choice. There's a mandate from Beijing. You gotta have that sewage system, otherwise we're shutting you down. And they've shut down thousands of polluting businesses everywhere in the country over the past 7-8 years. So the point I'm making is we're saying in the media in the US, we hope that China is going to cooperate with the US on climate change initiatives. And what I'm saying is that China, the Chinese leadership has its own pressure from inside, from their own people who are saying enough is enough. It's not enough to just make money and grow. We have to address this issue of climate change.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Xavier, thank you very, very much for your presentation, your answering your questions.
Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? That's the Rotary four-way test.
Now many years ago, in 1932, his company was headed down, he knew not what to do. Then Herbert Taylor started on a quest to keep his team from certain doom. He wrote the four-way test.
Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? That's the Rotary four-way test. Adopted some years later by Rotarians worldwide, some simple rules for dealing with the people by your side. A guide for life's decisions, no doubt one of the best. Just 24 quite simple words. The four-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? That's the Rotary four-way test. In the class or on the playground with your friends at school, you'll find that hurtful words and actions really aren't too cool. So as you make your choices of what to do or say, remember that old four-way test and you will be okay. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all